A Pirate's Cry by Clarence Chance. The boat rushed across the Caribbean Sea. The little boy struggled to keep his balance. Above the noise of the Yamaha engine, Dutchpot shouted, "You see that, boy?" Dutchpot revved up the engine a few more notches. Against its noise, he shouted, "This thing kicks like a kung fu fighter, boy!" The boat's front rose up into the air like a plane readying itself for takeoff. Then it fell, touching the sea for a second, then rising again, and the endless repetition of rising and falling. The little runaway 12-year-old boy was enthralled by it. "How you feel, boy?" Dutchpot shouted in his ear. And the boy, his expression a curious mix of fear and fascination, said, "I'm flying." Dutchpot shouted in his ear again. "What you say, boy?" The boy raised his voice and shouted back, "I feel like I'm flying." He was falling again. His hands flapped vigorously as he tried desperately not to fall into the hole someone had dug for him. He woke to find his hands beating down on the old bed. He gathered himself, stepped out of the boardhouse, and went and leaned on the bow of the solitary boat anchored on the quay. The sun was blazing overhead, throwing fire onto his bare back even as the water played with his feet. He stared vacantly out to the sea. It was not blue and beautiful, as it had been when Dutchpot had first brought him out into a boat that Sunday morning. The sea represented prison walls for David Barnaby, not 6 by 8 walls, but miles upon miles of impregnable prison walls. For even when Hurricanes Emily, Dennis, and Ivan threatened, they left him out there on the quay, since, as they put it, he knew too much of everything. And if he were to take a boat and run, where would he run to? Which direction was Kingston anyway? He had tried it once and drifted for 4 days in the open sea. The quay sat 100 kilometers southeast of Kingston. It was a bank of coral and sand, its east side covered by seagrass. Around it swam schools of parrot and snapperfish, and from holes in the sand little crabs appeared, then disappeared, again and again, and the small waves broke gently against the boat. There was a time when these waters were the domain of marauding and murderous pirates. It was a time when the great European power first enlisted pirates in wars against her enemies and then outlawed them. A cannonball to the midsection of the ship, a sword thrust through the body were means of death for many pirates on the Caribbean Sea. If you have the ear for it, you can still hear some pirate's forlorn, ghost-like cry on the breath of a rushing wave or on the almost silent purr of the Caribbean's currents. Again, his mind was replaying the incident. He had been looking for his football boots and suddenly stepped into his father's room and had seen him and a little girl together. Maybe it was a moral sense that his mother had instilled in him. Maybe it was what the police had said or the lawyer's arguments. But David had testified against his father in a carnal abuse case. David's testimony sent his father away for 3 years. No, he was thinking that nobody told him his testimony would have destroyed him. Nobody told him his own family would turn against him, or that the community too would turn against him. That's why he had run away. It was on that fateful Saturday night that he met Dutchpot, and it was Dutchpot who had turned him into a pirate. At night, David, Dutchpot, and the rest of the crew would travel in their speedboats to steal fish from the fisherman's pot. Things were getting worse, for over the last 6 months they had embarked upon armed robbery on the high seas, not just fish, but boat fuel, money, jewelry, and David was getting scared. To begin with, David had blamed his father. How could he do such a thing to a child? But then he started blaming himself. If I had just not walked in at the time I did, he thought. And no, he settled on blaming the girl. She should have known not to enter a man's room. See how she has wrecked my life? For 5 years, David Barnaby had been imprisoned on a quay southwest of Kingston, Jamaica. At night, he was a pirate, and by day, he was to make himself invisible. He knows too much. He might give us away, Dutchpot told the others. David Barnaby, leaning against the boat, thought he saw another boat on the horizon. Then he saw another, and then another. He rushed into the boardhouse and came back out with his binoculars. The other 4 crew members rushed out after him, puzzled. Through the binoculars, David saw that the first boat was Dutchpot's boat. 2 other boats were chasing it. The men came down to the water's edge. In a husky voice, one said, "Is what?" When David did not answer, the man grabbed the binoculars, peered through them, and shouted, "Police!" The 4 men quickly untied the boat, started the engine, and hopped in. "Take me, please," David pleaded, and he jumped in too. One man grabbed his feet, another his upper body, and they threw him overboard. David swam back to shore, feeling by the end as if his lungs would explode. His nose burned like fire. He lay on the beach exhausted. Sand covered his belly and chest and the left side of his face. David Barnaby cried. He heard when the boats approached, and he remained on his belly. He thought he heard a familiar voice, but then he thought it couldn't be. But he slowly turned over as the voice came again. "David, is that you?" Isaiah Barnaby rushed to his son and saw that he was alive. He was still hugging him when his wife came over from one of the boats. To her he said, "We found our boy Magdalene." They arrived back in Kingston late that day. At the family home in Patrick City, his sister called to him. "Come look on your little brother." David was surprised. "Mommy," he said, "you didn't say you had another child." Then he looked on her face and knew it was not her child. "Whose child is this, Daddy?" he asked his father. "David, you know a mistake was made 5 years ago? Well, it's sad to say, but another mistake was made 2 years ago, son." David's anger rose. "Daddy, you mean to say prison taught you nothing? And you, Mommy, how much more of this you're going to take?" He got up from the sofa. "Well, I'm not going to take this. Goodbye." "Are you running away again?" his mother asked. "No, Mommy. This time, I'm walking away." The scent in the Go-Go Club was one that a man could get used to. The lights were low and the music high. Young girls contorted their bodies around poles. David Barnaby sat on the stool feeling as lost as he'd felt a day ago. A shapely, scantily clad young woman came over to him. "Lap dance?" No, David said quickly. "I'm not feeling so hot tonight." "Relationship?" the girl shouted in David's ears. "More like family," David shouted back into her ear. "Why don't you pay for a private room and let's enjoy each other's company?" "Wish I could," David said. To his surprise, the girl took his hand and shouted in his ear, "Tonight's your lucky night." The private room was really not a room, but a cubicle. There was a passage in the middle of a large room with cubicles on both sides of it. They sat on a long, upholstered seat. The girl said, "So what were you saying about your family now?" "You see, my father is a very moral man, and my mother, She's so, well, stupid. Can I tell you a story? The girl said. David nodded. There was a girl who had no mother, no family to teach her about the things of the world. So she became attached to big people things very early. When she was 13, she was caught with a much older man who went to prison for 3 years because of it. When the man came out, they made the same mistake and a little boy was born. The man's wife took the child from the misguided girl and treated it as if it was her own. That misguided girl is me, and the man's wife is your mother. David rose quickly. You? You? David, go home to your family, the girl said tenderly. Your mother and father had searched the whole island for you when others would have given up. She sat looking at him for a moment, seeming genuinely to care for him. Your family needs you, and believe it or not, you need them too. Why are you lecturing me? David shouted. Do you know what I have gone through? Now the dancer rose angrily in turn. Do you know what I have gone through? Do you know what your mother and father went through? And she turned and walked out of the cubicle and left David there. David knocked timidly on the door of the family home. When his mother opened it, he hugged her as if his life depended on it.